The line in the report is almost too small for what it means. M60 ammunition was getting low at Fire Support Base Rawlins III. Not artillery ammunition, not fuel, not food. The ammunition feeding the machine guns on the perimeter. And the helicopter bringing more had already tried to come once. It couldn't. That is where I want to stay, because the official story of Rawlins III is full of bigger things. Mortars, rockets, airstrikes, gunships, artillery firing from inside the position. You can read all of that and miss the smaller problem working its way around the perimeter. Men behind the guns were counting what they had left. The record does not give me one named M60 gunner who reached down and found his last belt gone. I wish it did. It says something a little less dramatic and probably more useful. The troops on the line were running out of M60 ammunition, and the brigade called for emergency resupply. So, I am not going to invent a gunner and hand him words he never said. I am going to put us where the documents do put us. 4 miles east of Tay Ninh City, in late August 1968, at a fire support base that had already been fighting for hours, when somebody had to look at the remaining ammunition and decide it was no longer enough. That is a different kind of pressure than simply being under fire. If a rifleman was short, another man might have a magazine. If one position was short, somebody farther down the line might still have something to pass. Machine gun ammunition was often spread among more men than the gunner alone, because everybody understood what happened when the gun needed more, and the man carrying it was not beside him. That arrangement worked as long as the men and the ammunition stayed connected. A period infantry machine gun team on paper had a gunner, an assistant gunner, and, depending on the organization and actual strength, an ammunition bearer. In the field, the names on the table of organization mattered less than whether somebody close to the gun still had what the team needed. Units were under strength. Men were reassigned. People carried extra loads for one another. A clean 3-man team on paper could become 2 men, or 1 gunner with riflemen nearby sharing the burden. That is why I do not want to force the missing ammo bearer angle onto Rawlins. I found first-hand accounts from other Vietnam machine gunners who can name the men beside them and tell you exactly who carried their extra belts. Rawlins does not give us that luxury. The division paper gives us positions, not a complete crew roster. What it does show is the same dependency at a larger scale. The machine guns on the line were consuming ammunition faster than the perimeter could replace it from what was already inside the base. There is something useful in that difference. A machine gun can look self-contained in a photograph. 1 man, 1 gun. The fight around it was not self-contained at all. There were men carrying ammunition, men moving between fighting positions, radio operators getting requests out, supply people loading aircraft, pilots trying to reach the base, and other aircraft making room for them. When any one of those links slipped, the gunner was the man who saw the shortage in the simplest possible form. What had been beside him was no longer there. At Rawlins III, the whole base was being pulled apart at once. Just after midnight, enemy mortars started coming in. Then, the rate increased. Then, the ground attack began. Specialist 4 Lonnie Ramey, one of the men there, remembered RPGs coming in so heavily that there did not seem to be a hole deep enough to fight from. Around the base, infantrymen and artillerymen were trying to hold a perimeter against Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops moving in under the barrage. This was not a quiet little outpost, with one nervous gunner watching a tree line. Rawlins had mechanized infantry, artillery, mortars, radios, aircraft overhead, and men trying to keep all of it working at the same time. That matters, because ammunition does not disappear all at once. It disappears while other things are going wrong. A man moves to another position. A box gets left on the wrong side of a track. Somebody who had been carrying extra ammunition is now helping with a casualty. A position that expected a short contact stays in it much longer. What looked like plenty an hour earlier starts looking different after repeated attacks. Veterans from different units will remember that part differently, and I would expect them to. Some units spread machine gun ammunition widely. Some kept more of it close to the gun team. The paper organization and the field habit were not always the same thing. What Rawlins gives us is the result. The line was getting short. The base commander responsible for security, Captain William R. Houston, was already juggling support from outside the perimeter. Gunships from the 3rd Squadron, 17th Air Cavalry had been called in. Their fire helped in the open rice paddies, but men attacking through a rubber plantation were harder to deal with from the air. Artillery inside the position was used against the attack. Tactical aircraft were called. Illumination went up. The base had a lot of firepower around it. Then, the gunships began running low themselves. They had to leave Tay Ninh to rearm. Specialist 4 Larry Sutherland remembered the change after they went. The crack of the enemy rifles seemed closer. That is one of those details I trust, because it is not a speech. It is just a man remembering what changed when one layer of protection disappeared. And now the ground positions had their own ammunition problem. The Tropic Lightning News report says it plainly. Ammunition was getting low. A separate account from the same division is even more specific. Troops at Rawlins III were running out of M60 machine gun ammunition on the line. That sentence is doing a lot of work. An M60 was not just another rifle in the perimeter. It belonged to a crew, and even when the formal crew had been thinned out or reorganized in the field, the gun depended on other men bringing ammunition to it. The weight was one reason. The rate at which ammunition could disappear in a long fight was another. I am deliberately not going to turn this into a lesson on how to run an M60. Plenty of men watching this did that job, and they do not need me explaining their own gun to them. What matters here is the relationship between the gun and everybody around it. A gunner could carry only so much. The rest of the burden had to exist somewhere else in the squad: platoon, track, bunker line, or supply chain. That meant the machine gun was never really one man's weapon. It was a small logistics system with a man at the center of it. When that system started breaking, the gunner felt it first. And by the time Rawlins called for emergency resupply, the problem had already moved beyond one position. A helicopter crew from C Troop, 3rd Squadron, 17th Air Cavalry was given the job. Chief Warrant Officer Tom Holler was the pilot. Warrant Officer Earl Warwick was his co-pilot. Their UH-1H was loaded with about 1,000 pounds of ammunition. Notice what the story becomes at this point. The men on the ground are waiting for ammunition. The helicopter has the ammunition. The distance between those two facts is only a few miles, and they still cannot connect them. Holler's Huey headed toward Rawlins while an airstrike was working around the base. The crew could not simply push into the middle of it. They had to wait for an opening. They waited long enough that fuel became the next problem. The helicopter had to turn back to Tay Ninh. That is the turn in this story that I find hardest to shake. Imagine being on the ground and hearing that the resupply ship is coming. You have been told somebody is bringing what the line needs. Maybe you hear aircraft. Maybe somebody on the radio says the ship is nearby. Then it does not come in. There is nothing dishonest about why. The crew had an airstrike between them and the base. And a helicopter does not get extra fuel because the men below need it badly. Still, from the ground, the result was the same. No ammunition yet. This is where the title needs one correction. I cannot prove that one particular gunner at Rawlins fired his final belt before that Huey returned. The contemporary record does not name him. It says the M60 ammunition on the line was running out. I would rather leave that uncertainty in the story than manufacture a cleaner one. But if you were an M60 gunner, assistant gunner, ammo bearer, squad leader, or track crewman in Vietnam, this is the part I would like you to help with. When your unit started getting short during a long contact, where was the extra machine gun ammunition usually sitting before it reached the gun team? On other men? In a track? At a fighting position? Somewhere with the platoon? Give the unit and year if you remember them, because I suspect the answers are going to vary a lot. At Rawlins, there was no time to make the shortage elegant. The Huey refueled and went back. That turn back to Tay Ninh is easy to read past because it takes one sentence. For the crew, it meant doing the whole approach again. For the ground force, it meant the resupply clock had been reset, without the ammunition problem being reset with it. Nothing on the perimeter became cheaper while the helicopter was away. The attack did not pause to match the aircraft's fuel gauge. The airstrikes were still working the area. Holler later described looking down and seeing what he called a big war. That sounds almost casual until you remember what he was being asked to do. He was carrying 1,000 pounds of ammunition to a base under attack, and the first attempt had already failed because he could not get the timing to work. The second time, the crew waited again. Then the strike ended. Now the helicopter had its opening. Warwick remembered gunships covering the approach. An AC-47 overhead was dropping flares. Men at Rawlins had marked the drop point with a white T. Near the moment the Huey came in, a red star cluster went up and gave Holler enough light to see where he needed to be. Those details may sound small next to the attack, but this is exactly why I wanted to tell the story this way. The ammunition did not reach the perimeter because somebody wrote resupply on a radio log. It reached the perimeter because people in different places managed to connect a helicopter, a marked point on the ground, aircraft overhead, fuel, light, timing, and a base that could not wait much longer. And there was one more complication. The fire was still too heavy for a normal landing. The Huey could not settle in and sit there while men unloaded it. So the crew came over the position, and the ammunition was pushed out while the aircraft stayed moving above the base. The division account describes cases falling to the ground inside the position. That is the moment the entire episode has been moving toward. Not the first shot of the fight, not the biggest explosion. Boxes of ammunition hitting the ground where men had been waiting for them. There is a photograph somewhere in your mind if you lived around helicopters in Vietnam, even if you were nowhere near Rawlins. The aircraft is there for a few seconds. Men on the ground are trying to get what came in away from the open area. The ship does not belong there any longer than it has to. The men at Rawlins still had to move that ammunition from where it landed to the positions that needed it. That part rarely gets a paragraph. A resupply does not end when the load reaches the ground. Somebody has to find the right case. Somebody has to drag or carry it through a position already crowded with men, radios, equipment, and casualties. Somebody has to know which section is short and which one can wait. And somewhere on that perimeter, an M60 gunner who had been watching his supply shrink finally had more coming toward him instead of away from him. I like the fact that the records do not give us a heroic sentence for that man. They do not say he held until the last round. They do not say he refused to leave his gun. They do not give him a nickname or a speech. They just tell us the ammunition was running out and the helicopter came back. That is enough. Because the real discipline in a situation like this is not theatrical. It is ordinary men keeping track of something that is disappearing while everything around them is demanding more of it. The shortage also changes the way you hear the earlier part of the battle. When the gunships left to rearm, the enemy fire felt closer to Sutherland. When the ground ammunition dropped toward the danger point, Rawlins called emergency resupply. When the first Huey attempt failed, fuel forced the aircraft away. Every layer of the defense had a limit. Aircraft had ammunition limits. Aircraft had fuel limits. Ground positions had ammunition limits. Men had limits too, although the reports are usually worse at recording those. The battle kept asking somebody to replace what the last few minutes had used up. That is what makes Rawlins III different from the usual picture of an American fire support base as a place with endless firepower. From the outside, it could look that way. Artillery inside the perimeter, mechanized infantry, gunships, tactical aircraft, an AC-47 overhead, flares, radios connecting the base to headquarters. But down at one fighting position, all of that could still narrow into a very plain question. How much is left here? That question is not dramatic until the answer changes. The fight at Rawlins went on for about 5 hours. Airstrikes continued. Artillery and infantry fire kept pressure on the attacking force. Eventually, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops began to break contact and pull away. The base held. I am not going to turn that into the end of a larger speech, because the best ending is already sitting in the record. Tom Holler's Huey had carried roughly 1,000 pounds of ammunition toward Rawlins, had been forced to turn back when the first opening never came, refueled at Tay Ninh, and then returned to try again. The second time, the crew got over the base. They did not land. They got the load out, and the ammunition finally reached the men who had been waiting for it.